What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the FantasyPros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we are talking about 10 players that you should be looking to stash ahead of the Week 10 slate and ahead of next week's waivers as well. Before we dive on into that list of players, though, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football MyPlaybook app. Again, all you have to do, visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football MyPlaybook app to optimize your roster today. Kicking off our list this week is Los Angeles Rams wide receiver Demarcus Robinson, who's rostered in 25% of leagues. Robinson's production has come in a multitude of ways recently. In Week 8, he caught 2 of 3 targets for only 37 yards, but 2 touchdowns, good for 17.5 fantasy points. In Week 9, he stepped in for an ejected Puka Nacua and caught 6 of 9 targets for 94 yards and another 2 scores, good for 27.4 fantasy points in the wide receiver 5 on the week. This might feel like we're chasing recent fluky production, but I don't think it is. When we look back to last season between weeks 12 to 17, when this Rams offense was 100% healthy, Demarcus Robinson was the wide receiver 23 while scoring 4 times during that stretch. I'm not promising top 24 production rest of the season, but this Rams offense is a different animal at full strength, so stash Demarcus Robinson and see if he can continue his hot streak. Our second stash this week is Ray McCloud, wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons, who's rostered in 17% of leagues. As of this recording, it's unclear whether Drake London will play in Week 10, but this is where we can take advantage of that uncertainty and stash the next man up. McCloud is on the field constantly for this offense, logging at least 88% of the snaps in 7 of his last 8 games, while also running at least 92% of the routes in 7 of his last 8. The target share hasn't been there, unfortunately, so he's only seen 3 to 4 targets in each of his last 4 games, but again, if Drake London misses time, we should see a rise in production here. I get McCloud isn't a super fun stash, but he may end up being a serviceable option for the near future. If you're in need of a tight end, you can look to stash Jonnu Smith of the Miami Dolphins, who's rostered in 17% of leagues. With Tua Tagovailoa back, a lot of people initially thought Jonnu would just fade into the shadows of this offense, but he's remained a mainstay. Over the last 3 weeks, Jonnu Smith has drawn the 10th most targets in the league and has run at least 70% of routes in each game. He's also drawn a target on at least 21% of his routes in each of his last 4 games, including a game where he was targeted on 37% of his routes. I know Jonnu Smith isn't the most sexy name, but he gets a solid schedule coming up with the Rams, Raiders, Patriots, and Packers in his next 4 games, which are all plus matchups for the Dolphins tight end. If the quarterback position is looking bleak on your team, stash Drake Maye of the New England Patriots, who's rostered in only 13% of leagues. I won't go as far as calling Drake Maye a league winner because that would be purely reckless, but he does have the profile that can still produce fantasy points even when he struggles. In his first 2 career starts, he finished as a quarterback 10 and quarterback 7. In Week 9, he wasn't as good through the air, but he added 95 rushing yards on 8 attempts on the ground. Nobody thinks of Drake Maye as an elite scrambler, but he can make plays with his legs and give you an additional 3 to 9 points almost every single week. The Bears are a tough matchup in Week 10, but even looking at Houston, Miami, and Indy in the 3 games afterwards, there's plenty of opportunity for Drake Maye to be a fantasy-relevant quarterback. Circling back to the running back position, let's talk about Cam Akers of the Minnesota Vikings, who's rostered in 10% of leagues. For whatever reason, the Vikings just don't want Ty Chandler involved in this offense right now. Aaron Jones still played a majority of the snaps against the Colts last week, but it was Cam Akers who came in for relief and logged 16 snaps to Chandler's 0. Yes, Chandler did not play a single snap. On Akers' 16 snaps, he was given 8 touches and totaled 53 yards, which isn't anything to write home about, but this is at least a good sign for his role going forward. We all know Aaron Jones doesn't possess the cleanest bill of health, and should he miss time this season, Akers appear to be in line for the 1A role. There's likely little to no standalone value here with Akers, but if you're the Aaron Jones manager, or just want to frustrate the Aaron Jones manager in your league, stash Cam Akers and the upside he possesses. Another wide receiver to consider stashing this week is Jalen Coker of the Carolina Panthers, who's rostered in 10% of leagues. After a 17.8 fantasy point performance in Week 8, the fantasy universe was going nuts over the undrafted free agent out of Holy Cross. He unfortunately came back down to earth in week 9, only catching 2 of 3 targets for 36 yards. However, I still think there's a path forward here for Jalen Coker. Not only has Deontay Johnson left town, but Jonathan Mingo was traded to the Cowboys at the trade deadline. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend Jonathan Mingo was holding Jalen Coker back, but I do think it's worth noting that Mingo still played 28% of snaps and ran 30% of routes in week 9. While that may not directly lead to more production, it may lead to more field time with opportunity for Coker to improve his production. Jalen Coker might be the most fun name on this list, so if you're in a deep league and need a dart throw, look Jalen Coker's way. Our next stash is Indianapolis Colts wide receiver Adonai Mitchell, who's rostered in 6% of leagues. This stash is for those of y'all in the deepest of leagues that can afford to stash a one injury away player like Adonai Mitchell. The production isn't there right now. He's only had one game with more than 5 fantasy points this year. However, the switch to Joe Flacco at quarterback should continue to improve this Colts passing attack, and Michael Pittman Jr. hasn't looked like himself at all recently. We got reports of him potentially landing on IR a few weeks back, yet he's continuing to battle it out on the field despite being in obvious pain. If he misses any time, Adonai Mitchell is the next guy up. Again, I'm not expecting Mitchell to give you any production as the 4th option in this passing attack, but if any of these Colts weapons miss time, Mitchell becomes a much more intriguing option with Joe Flacco under center. Coming in next is Jaylen Wright of the Miami Dolphins, who's rostered in 6% of leagues. Let's do a quick reality check with the Dolphins. They're currently 2-6, with only a 5% chance of making the playoffs this year per NFL.com. Tua's back, and this offense is still high functioning after nearly knocking off the Bills in week 9. What's stopping them from giving Jaylen Wright more potential reps down the stretch? You could run the wheels off of Raheem Mostert if you want, but he's 32 years old, and the team also has an out in his contract after this year where they'd only eat $1 million in dead cap. We could start to see Wright play more alongside Devon Achane should they start to pivot away from Raheem Mostert. The schedule coming up is favorable as well, getting the Raiders, Patriots, and Packers between weeks 11 to 13. Again, you'll likely only stash Wright in a deeper league, but he's worth a look if you need upside. Our final running back stash this week is Audric Estime of the Denver Broncos, who's rostered in 2% of leagues. Reports keep coming out that Estime is going to get more touches in this Broncos offense moving forward, and while it's TBD how valuable they'll be, it's worth biting on in deeper leagues. Estime and McLaughlin both got 5 carries against the Ravens in week 9, but we could start to see the tides turn towards Estime becoming the 1B in this backfield. I don't think he supplants Javonte Williams, but we could easily see Estime start to get 7 to 8 carries to Javonte's 13 to 14. In your standard 12-man leagues, Estime is a waste of a roster spot, but if you're playing in a 16-plus man league or have deep benches, I'd take a look Estime's way to see if anything comes from this week's reports. Last but not least, for all of you playing in leagues where you start a defense and special teams, you can look to stash the Miami Dolphins, who are rostered in 33% of leagues. Surprisingly, the Dolphins are the second lowest scoring defense in fantasy football this year, so why would I tell you to stash them? Again, we have to look ahead past week 10 and look at week 11 where they get the Las Vegas Raiders, which is a matchup we definitely want to target. Even in week 12, they get the New England Patriots, and while things have gotten better with Drake Maye, the Dolphins could be a streamable option still there. It's always smart to stay one step ahead of your league mate, so let's make sure you get this unit stashed now so you're set for week 11. Alrighty, y'all, that is it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Again, all you have to do, visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app to optimize your roster today.